Christ, said Jack, as the shattering din of the carpenter's hammer prized him from his old hold on sleep. He clung to the soft darkness as hard as he could, burying his face in his pillow, for his mind had been racing so that he had not dropped off until 6, indeed. It was his appearance on deck. At first light, peering at the yards and rigging that had given rise to the rumor that he was up and about, and this was the reason for the carpenter's untimely zeal, just as it was for the nervous presence of the gun-room steward. The former Captain Stewart had gone over to the palace, hovering with what had been Captain Allen's invariable breakfast, a mug of small beer, hominy grits, and cold beef. But there was no sleeping. The echoing crash of the hammer right next to his ear, ludicrously followed by the sound of whispering between the carpenter and his mates, made certain of that. They were in his sleeping cabin, of course. Jets of pain shot through Jack's head as he lay there, fast. That bloody hammering he called, and almost against his shoulder came the shocked reply, "Aye, aye, sir," and the tiptoe pittering away. His voice was hoarse. "What made me so damn garrulous yesterday," he said, still lying there in his cot. "I'm as hoarse as a crow with talking. And what made me launch out in wild invitations, a guest I know nothing about and a very small brig I have scarcely seen." He pondered gloomily upon the extreme care that should be taken with shipmates cheek by jowl, very like marriage, the inconvenience of pragmatic, touchy, assuming companions, incompatible tempers mewed up together in a box. His manual of seamanship, and how he had conned it as a boy, poring over the impossible equations. Let the angle YCB to which the yard is braced up be called the trim of the sails and expressed by the symbol B. This is the complement of the angle DCI now. CI ID equals RAD. TAN DCI equals I. TAN DCI equals Coton. Therefore, we have finally Coton B equals A1 B1 tan 2 squared 2 times, and A1 Coton B equals B argent squared, and tan 1x equals AB cot. This equation evidently ascertains the mutual relation between the trim of the sails and the leeway. It is quite evident it is it not, Jackie, darling, said a hopeful voice, and a rather large young woman bent kindly over him, for at this stage in his memory he was only 12, a stocky little boy and tall, nubile Queenie sailed high above. "Why, no, Queenie," said the infant Jack, "to tell you the truth, it ain't." "Well," said she with untiring patience, "try to remember what a contingent is. And let us begin again. Let us consider the ship as an oblong box." For a while he considered the Sophie as an oblong box. He had not seen a great deal of her, but there were 2 or 3 fundamentals that he knew with absolute certainty. One was that she was under-rigged. She might be well enough close to the wind, but she would be a slug before it. Another was that his predecessor had been a man of a temper entirely unlike his own. And another was that the Sophie's people had come to resemble their captain, a good, sound, quiet, careful, unaggressive commander who never set his royals, as brave as could be when set upon, but the very opposite of a Sally Rover. Said Jack, it would sweep the ocean clean, and his mind descending fast to the commonplace dwelt on the prize money that would result from sweeping the ocean even moderately clean. That despicable main yard, he said, and surely to God I can get a couple of 12-pounders as chasers. Would her timber stand it, though? But whether they can or not, the box can be made a little more like a fighting vessel, more like a real man of war. As his thoughts ranged on, so the low cabin brightened steadily. A fishing boat passed under the Sophie's stern, laden with tunny and uttering the harsh roar of a conch. At almost the same time, the sun popped up from behind St. Philip's Fort. It did, in fact, pop up, flattened like a sideways lemon in the morning haze, and drawing its bottom free of the land with a distinct jerk. In little more than a minute, the grayness of the cabin had utterly vanished. The deck head was alive with light glancing from the rippling sea, and a single ray reflected from some unmoving surface on the distant quay darted through the cabin windows to light up Jack's coat and its blazing epaulet. The sun rose within his mind, obliging his dogged look to broaden into a smile, and he swung out of his cot. The sun had reached Dr. Maturin 10 minutes earlier, for he was a good deal higher up. He too stirred and turned away, for he too had slept uneasily, but the brilliance prevailed. He opened his eyes and stared about very stupidly. A moment before he had been so solidly, so warmly and happily in Ireland, with a girl's hand under his arm. That his waking mind could not take in the world he saw. Her touch was still firm upon his arm, and even her scent was there. Vaguely he picked at the crushed leaves under him. Dianthus perfringens. The scent was reclassified a flower, and nothing more, and the ghostly contact, the firm print of fingers, vanished. His face reflected the most piercing unhappiness, and his eyes misted over. He had been exceedingly attached, and she was so bound up with that time. He had been quite unprepared for this particular blow, striking under every conceivable kind of armor, and for some minutes he could hardly bear the pain, but sat there blinking in the sun. Christ, he said at last, another day. With this, his face grew more composed. He stood up, beat the white dust from his breeches, and took off his coat to shake it. With intense mortification, he saw that the piece of meat he had hidden out of yesterday's dinner had oozed grease through his handkerchief and his pocket. How wonderfully strange, he thought, to be upset by this trifle, yet I am upset. He sat down and ate the piece of meat, the eye of a mutton chop, and for a moment his mind dwelt on the theory of counter-irritants, Paracelsus, Cardan, phases. He was sitting in the ruined apse of St. Damian's Chapel, high above Port Mahon on the north side, looking down upon the great winding inlet of the harbor, and far out beyond it over a vast expanse of sea. A variegated blue with wandering lanes, the flawless sun a hand's breadth high, rising from the side of Africa. He had taken refuge there some days before. As soon as his landlord began to grow a shade uncivil, he had not waited for a scene, for he was too emotionally worn to put up with any such thing. Presently, he took notice of the ants that were taking away his crumbs, Tapenoma erraticum. They were walking in a steady two-way stream across the hollow or dell of his inverted wig, as it lay there looking very like an abandoned bird's nest. Though once it had been as neat a physical bob as had ever been seen in Stephen's Green, they hurried along with their abdomens high, jostling, running into one another. His gaze followed the wearisome little creatures, and while he was watching them, a toad was watching him. Their eyes met, and he smiled. A splendid toad, a 2-pound toad with brilliant tawny eyes. How did he manage to make a living in the sparse, thin grass of that stony, sun-beaten landscape, so severe and parched, with no more cover than a few tumbles of pale stone, a few low creeping hook-thorn caper bushes, and a cistus whose name Stephen did not know? Most remarkably severe and parched, for the winter of 1799 to 1800 had been uncommonly dry. The March rains had failed, and now the heat had come very early in the year. Very gently he stretched out his finger and stroked the toad's throat. The toad swelled a little and moved its crossed hands and sat easy, gazing back. The sun rose and rose. The night had not been cold at any time, but still the warmth was grateful. Black wheat ears that must have brewed not far. One of the smaller eagles in the sky. There was a sloth snakeskin in the bush where he pissed, and its eye covers were perfect, startlingly crystalline. What am I to think of Captain Aubrey's invitation? He said aloud in that great emptiness of light and air, all the more vast for the inhabited patch down there and its movement. And the checkered fields behind, shading into pale, dun, formless hills. Was it merely Jack ashore? Yet he was such a pleasant, ingenuous companion. He smiled at the recollection. Still in all, what weight can be attached to? We had dined extremely well, 4 bottles or possibly 5. I must not expose myself to an affront. He turned it over and over, arguing against his hopes, but coming at last to the conclusion that if he could make his coat passably respectable, and the dust does seem to be getting it off, or at least disguising it, He said he would call on Mr. Flory at the hospital and talk to him in a general way about the naval surgeon's calling. He brushed the ants from his wig and settled it on his head. Then, as he walked down towards the edge of the road, the magenta spikes of gladioli in the taller grass, the recollection of that unlucky name stopped him in his stride. How had he come to forget it so entirely in his sleep? How was it possible that the name James Dillon had not presented itself at once of his waking mind? Yes, it is true there are hundreds of Dillons, he reflected, and a great many of them are called James, of course. Christ, hummed James Dillon under his breath, shaving the red gold bristles off his face in what light could make its way through the scuttle of the Burford's number 12 gunport. Christe eleison. Kyrie. This was less piety in James Dillon than a way of hoping he should not cut himself. For like so many papists, he was somewhat given to blasphemy. The difficulty of the planes under his nose silenced him, however, and when his upper lip was clean, he could not hit the note again. In any case, his mind was too busy to be seeking after an elusive noom, for he was able to report to a new captain, a man upon whom his comfort and ease of mind was to depend, to say nothing of his reputation, career, and prospects of advancement. Stroking his shining smoothness, he hurried out into the wardroom and shouted for a marine. Just brush the back of my coat, will you, Curtis? My chest is quite ready, and the bread sack of books is to go with it, he said. Is the captain on deck? Oh, no, sir, no, said the marine. Breakfast only just carrying in this moment 2 hard-boiled eggs and 1 soft. The soft-boiled egg was for Miss Smith to recruit her from her labors of the night, as both the marine and Mr. Dillon knew very well. But the marine's knowing look met with a total lack of response. James Dillon's mouth tightened, and for a fleeting moment, as he ran up the ladder to the sudden brilliance of the quarter-deck, it wore a positively angry expression. Here he greeted the officer of the watch and the Burford's first lieutenant. Good morning to you. My word, you're very fine, they said. There she lies, just beyond the General. My eyes ranged over the busy harbor. The light was so nearly horizontal that all the masts and yards assumed a strange importance, and the little skipping wave sent back a blinding sparkle. No, they said. Over by the sheer hulk, the felucca has just masked her. There, now do you see her? He did indeed. He had been looking far too high, and his gaze had swept right over the Sophie as she lay there, not much above a cable's length away, very low in the water. He leant both hands on the rail and looked at her with unwinking concentration. After a while, he borrowed the telescope from the officer of the watch and did the same again with a most searching, minute scrutiny. He could see the gleam of an epaulette, whose wearer could only be her captain, and her people were as active as bees just about to swarm. He had been prepared for a little brig, but not for quite such a dwarfish vessel as this. Most 14-gun sloops were between 200 and 250 tons in burthen. The Sophie could scarcely be more than 150. I like her little quarter-deck, said the officer of the watch. She was the Spanish Vencejo, was she not? And as for being rather low, why, anything you look at close to from a 74 looks rather low. There were 3 things that everybody knew about the Sophie. One was that unlike almost other brigs, she had a quarter-deck. Another was that she had been Spanish. And a third was that she possessed an elm tree pump on her forecastle, that is to say, a bored-out trunk that communicated directly with a sea, and that was used for washing her deck. An insignificant piece of equipment, really, but one so far above her station that no mariner who saw it or heard of this pump ever forgot it. Maybe your quarters will be a little cramped, said the first lieutenant, but you will have a quiet, restful time of it, I am sure, convoying the trade up and down the Mediterranean. Well, said James Dillon, unable to find a brisk report to this possibly well-intentioned kindness. Well, he said with a philosophical shrug, you'll let me have a boat, sir. I should like to report as early as I can. A boat? God rot my soul, cried the first lieutenant. I shall be asked for the barge next thing I know. Passengers in the Burford wait for a bumboat from shore, Mr. Dillon, or else they swim. He stared at James with cold severity until the quartermaster's chuckle betrayed him, for Mr. Coffin was a great wag, a wag even before breakfast. "Dillon, sir, reporting for duty, if you please," said James, taking off his hat in the brilliant sun and displaying a blaze of dark red hair. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Dillon," said Jack, touching his own, holding out his hand, and looking at him with so intense a desire to know what kind of man he was, that his face had an almost forbidding acuity. "You would be welcome in any case, but even more so this morning. We have a busy day ahead of us, masthead. There. Any sign of life on the wharf?" "Nothing yet, sir." "The wind is exactly where I want it," said Jack, looking for the 100th time at the rare white cloud sailing evenly across the perfect sky. "But with this rising glass, there is no trusting to it." "Your coffee's up, sir," said the steward. "Thank you, Killick. What is it, Mr. Lamb?" "I have no ring bolts anywheres near big enough, sir," said the carpenter. "But there's a heap on 'em at the yard, I know. May I send over?" "No, Mr. Lamb. Don't you go near that yard to save your life. Double the clench bolts you have. Set up the forge and fashion a serviceable ring. It won't take you half an hour. Now, Mr. Dillon, when you have settled in comfortably below, perhaps you will come and drink a cup of coffee with me, and I will tell you what I have in mind." James hurried below to the three-cornered booth that he was to live in, whipped out of his reporting uniform into trousers and an old blue coat, reappearing while Jack was still blowing thoughtfully upon his cup. "Sit down, Mr. Dillon, sit down," he cried. "Push those papers aside. It's a sad brew, I'm afraid, but at least it was wet. Then I can promise you sugar." "Sugar?" "If you please, sir," said young Ricketts. "The Jenna Rose cutter is alongside with the men who were drafted off for harbor duty. All of them. All except two, sir, that have been changed." So holding his coffee cup, Jack writhed from behind the table and with a twist of his body out through the door, hooked onto the labored main chains. There was the Jenna Rose boat filled with seamen looking up, laughing, and exchanging witticisms or mere hoots and whistles with their former shipmates. The Jenna Rose midshipman saluted and said, "Captain Hart's compliments, sir, and he finds a draft can be spared." "God bless your heart, dear Molly," said Jack, and aloud, "My compliments and best thanks to Captain Hart. Be so good as to send them aboard." They were not much to look at, he reflected, as the whip from the yard arm hoisted up their meager belongings. 3 or 4 were decidedly simple, and 2 others had that indefinable air of men of some parts whose cleverness sets them apart from their fellows, but not nearly so far as they imagine. 2 of the boobies were quite horribly dirty, and one had managed to exchange his slops for a red garment with remains of tinsel upon it. Still, they all possessed 2 hands. They could all clap onto a rope, and it would be strange if the boatswain and his mates could not induce them to heave. "Deck!" hailed the midshipman aloft. "Deck! There is someone moving about on the wharf." "Very good, Mr. Babington. You may come down and have your breakfast now. 6 hands, I thought, lost for good," he said to James Dillon with intense satisfaction, turning back to the cabin. "They may not be much to look at, indeed. I think we must rig a tub if we are not to have an itchy ship, but they will help us weigh, and I hope to weigh by 9:30 at the latest." Jack wrapped the brass-bound wood of the locker and went on, "We will ship 2 long 12s as chase pieces, if I can get them from ordnance. But whether or no I am going to take the sloop out while this breeze lasts to try her paces, we can buoy a dozen merchantmen to Cagliari, sailing this evening if they are all here, and we must know how she handles. Yes, Mr. Pulling, sir. Master's mate. Burford's longboat alongside with a draft." "Draft for us, how many?" 18, sir, and rum-looking cullies some of them are. He would have added if he had dared." "Do you know anything about him, Mr. Dillon?" asked Jack. "I knew the Burford had a good many of the Charlotte's people, and some from the receiving ships as drafts from the Mayans, sir. But I never heard of any being meant for the Sophie." Jack was on the point of saying, "And there I was, worrying about being stripped bare," but he contented himself with chuckling and wondering why this cornucopia should have poured itself out on him. Lady Warren came the reply in a flash of revelation. He laughed again and said, "Now I'm going across to the wharf, Mr. Dillon. Mr. Head is a business-like man, and he will tell me whether the guns are to be had or not within half an hour. If they are, I will break out my handkerchief, and you can start carrying out the warps directly. What now, Mr. Richards?" "Sir," said the pale clerk, "Mr. Purser says I should bring you the receipts and letters to sign this time every day, and the fair copied book to read." "Quite right," said Jack mildly, "every ordinary day. Presently you will learn which is ordinary and which is not." He glanced at his watch. "Here are the receipts for the men. Show me the rest another time." The scene on deck was not unlike Cheapside, with road work going on. 2 parties under the carpenter and his crew were making ready for the places for the hypothetical bow and stern chasers, and parcels of assorted landmen and boobies stood about with their baggage, some watching the work with an interested air, offering comments, others gaping vacantly about, gazing into the sky as though they had never seen it before. 1 or 2 had even edged onto the holy quarter-deck. "What in God's name is this infernal confusion?" cried Jack. "Mr. Watt, this is a king's ship, not the Margate Hoy. You, sir, get away for it." For a moment, until his unaffected blaze of indignation galvanized them into activity, the Sophie's warrant officers gazed at him sadly. He caught the words, "All these people." "I'm going ashore," he went on. "By the time I come back, this deck will present a very different appearance." He was still red in the face as he went down into the boat after the midshipmen. "Do they really imagine I shall leave an able-bodied man on shore if I can cram him aboard?" he said to himself. "Of course, their precious 3 watches will have to go, and even so, 14 inches will be hard to find." The 3-watch system was a humane arrangement that allowed the men to sleep a whole night through from time to time, whereas with 2 watches, 4 hours was the most they could ever hope for. But on the other hand, it did mean that half the men had the whole of the available space to sling their hammocks, since the other half was on deck. 18 and 6 is 24, said Jack. "And 50 or thereabout," said 75. "Say 75. And about how many shall I watch?" He worked out this figure in order to multiply it by 14, for 14 inches was the space the regulations allowed for each hammock, and it seemed to him very doubtful whether the Sophie possessed anything like that amount of room. Whatever her official complement might be, he was still working at it when the midshipman called, "On row, boat your oars," and they kissed gently against the wharf. "Go back to the ship now, Mr. Rickett," said Jack on an impulse. "I do not suppose I shall be long, and it may save a few minutes." But with the Burford's draft, he had missed his chance. Other captains were there before him now, and he had to wait his turn. He walked up and down in the brilliant morning sun with one whose epaulet matched his own, Middleton, whose greater pull had enabled him to snap up the command of the Virtus, the charming French privateer that would have been Jack's had there been any justice in the world. When they had exchanged the naval gossip of the Mediterranean, Jack remarked that he had come for a couple of 12-pounders. "Do you think she'll bear them?" asked Middleton. "I hope so. Your 4-pounder is a pitiful thing, though I must confess I feel anxious for her knees." "Well, I hope so, too," said Middleton, shaking his head. "At all events, you have come on the right day. It seems that Head is to be placed under Brown, and he has taken such a spite at it that he is selling off his stock like a fishwife at the end of the fair." Jack had already heard something of this development in the long squabble between the Ordnance Board and the Navy Board, and he longed to hear more, but at this moment Captain Hollowell came out, smiling all over his face, and Middleton, who had some faint remains of the conscience, said, "You take my turn, I shall be in age with all my coronades to explain." "Good morning, sir," said Jack. "I am Aubrey of the Sophie, and I should like to try a couple of long 12s, if you please." With no change in his melancholy expression, Mr. Head said, "You know what they weigh? Something in the nature of 3,300 weight, I believe." 3,300 weight, 3 pounds, 3 ounces, 3 pennyweight. Have a dozen, Captain, if you feel she will bear them." "Thank you. 2 will be plenty," said Jack, looking sharply to see whether he were being made game of. "They are yours, then?" and upon your own head be it, said Mr. Head with a sigh, making secret marks upon a worn, curling parchment slip. Give it to the Master Parker, and he will troll you out as a pretty a pair as ever the heart of man could desire. I have some neat mortars if you have room. I'm extremely obliged to you, Mr. Head, said Jack, laughing with pleasure. I wish the rest of the service were run, so do I, Captain, so do I, cried Mr. Head, his face drowning suddenly dark with passion. There are some slack-arsed, bloody-minded men, flute-playing, fiddle-scraping, present-seeking, tale-bearing, double-poxed hounds that would keep you waiting about for a month, but I am not one of them. Captain Middleton, sir, carronades for you, I presume.